Hey everybody, it's Vanessa, the Crafty Gemini, and welcome to WIP Wednesday, episode number 77. So if you're new here, WIP Wednesday, the WIP at the beginning of the name of our live show stands for Work in Progress. So we have recently changed the format to where I am now answering and doing demos for your pre-submitted questions. So if you have a question that you'd like me to consider to answer, show, demo, give you some extra tips and tricks, or help you troubleshoot something in your sewing and quilting projects, feel free to use the link that we have in the description box of this video or in the caption if you're watching us on Facebook. Let's go ahead and just take a quick check, make sure everyone can see me and hear me. I see a bunch of you have already started typing in the chat box. Hi Tamara, tuning in from Chicago. So Diva5691 is in the house from Southern California. Hi Diana. All right, hey Sue, and I am coming to you all from my home crafting studio here in North Central Florida, where it was like 35 degrees this morning and now it's in the 70s, typical for us here. All right, good. So if you can see me and hear me, just, type something in the chat box. That way we can make sure. Oh, hi, Mary. Mary says, I've never caught a live before. Well, welcome. So speaking of catching our lives, we go live on Wednesdays. We tend to kind of shift around the times sometimes on the Wednesdays because it depends on our schedule. So currently, my son is 13 and his basketball schedule just kicked in. They just started playing and they have a game tonight, so we couldn't keep our usual time of 7 p.m. So for the next couple of months, we are going to be going live for WIP Wednesday episodes at 2 p.m. Eastern time, and that's 1 p.m. Central. So if you can't tune in at this time and maybe you're watching the replay, just know that in a couple of months, when I send my update emails, I'll let you know, hey, we're back to the usual time once his basketball season is over, okay? So let's go ahead and get started. I have 4 questions I'm going to try to get through today. And the first one is from Kathy. So Kathy asks, can you demonstrate how to remove a cam snap that was installed incorrectly? Okay, so first I wanted to, let's go ahead and switch to the over my shoulder camera here, and I'm going to show you first what cam snaps are. A lot of different companies will make these plastic snaps. Snaps, as you know, from buying stuff or making stuff, they can be plastic or metal. They come in a lot of different styles, out of different materials and different sizes and all that. But when we talk about cam snaps, we're usually talking about this size. And I can't remember if it's a size 16 or a size 20. It's one of those two. Those are the 2 most common sizes. But basically, it measures 1/2 inch here in diameter. Okay, that's what the ones that I'm using, just about, yep, 1/2 inch. So you can use these smaller or bigger depending on the project, but I find that this size works really well. If you don't yet have cam snaps and you've seen them in little pouch projects like I've done here, then definitely use my affiliate link that I have in the caption of this Facebook post or in the video description box if you're watching us on YouTube, and you can check out the starter kit that I recommend. The way that these work is that you have basically 4 parts to a snap, and we'll go into installing it and removing one that's installed incorrectly. But for anyone watching new here, I just wanted to show you what they actually are. It's a quick and easy way to add a quick closure to a project. These little pouches here are made out of 1 piece or 2 pieces of faux leather. 1 piece that's trimmed with a template. But this is one of my free projects that I have on YouTube as well, and we sell the sheets of this faux leather in 4 packs and assorted packs like that. Well, you basically make the pouch, and at the last step is when we install the snap. It's super quick and easy. You have 2 end caps that are smooth like this, and you need one of those on each side of the parts that actually attach. So they usually are referenced as the male and the female ends of a snap, or you can also hear them called, I think, the stud and the socket of the snap. But you see how we have this smooth end cap here. We have another one of those end caps on the inside of this female end because that is what's basically holding the other parts in place. So it's really important that you either follow the pattern instructions or check out, if you're following one of my many snap tutorials that I have, all types of little pouches and projects for these snaps. I always go in and step by step tell you where to place which one and facing which way, because you have to make sure that you orient the male and female ends correctly so that it's actually a working snap and you don't end up with like an end cap here that this is not going to snap into. Okay, so that's one little freebie project that I have there. And then I wanted to share this other video course. This is a paid for course that we offer in our online shop. And I actually went ahead and put this one on sale. So it's $10 off right now, only for the next 48 hours. So if you're catching us live, you're hearing about it as soon as you can. If you're watching the replay, hopefully it's before Friday of this week, and you'll be able to snag this class. This is my duo project bag. On the front here, you see we have fabric, we have vinyl. It's a kind of a quilt, it's bound. We have a handle here, but we have these three snaps installed to make this front gusseted front pocket. So I have a ruler, my rotary cutter slid down there, but you can see there's 6 fat quarters in here. You can put your incomplete or unfinished quilt blocks. I use mine also for my yarn, crochet hooks, needles, and things like that. And so it's called a duo project bag because you have one pocket, and then the second pocket is a zippered pocket on the back. So if you're kind of newer to sewing, but you want to make little project bags like this and organizers, this is a great one to start with because you're learning so many different techniques. How to make a quilted project, how to make an attached binding. We're installing a zipper here. We're installing a handle, a flap, and of course, clear vinyl, as well as 3 snaps. And so this is something else I wanted to show you, that we can install those cam snaps through the clear plastic as well. Okay, remember, this is the female end, and of course, on the back, what's holding it is the end cap, like I mentioned earlier. Okay, so if you want to check out that course or sign up and save the 10 bucks, the link is in the caption or in the description box below for you. So now let's go ahead and open up. Y'all that have been following me for over a decade probably are sick and tired of seeing this little snap box, but it holds everything in here, and I've had them in here probably going on 14, 15 years. Now, I have a lot of experience with these snaps because I cloth diapered my kids, and I have probably gone through hundreds of these snaps, installing them and also removing them when I install them incorrectly, which usually just happens at the beginning, okay? So if you use my affiliate link for the Cam Snap starter kit that we've linked to, you're going to get a couple different things. You'll get the hand setting snap tool. It comes with a little screwdriver because you can change out the little parts here. If you're ordering different size snaps, you'll need to change out the pieces here to install the correct size pieces that need, that match up with the size of the snap that you're installing. Then you get this sharp stiletto or an awl, and this is really sharp on the end because we actually use it to pierce a hole through our fabric layers where we want to install that snap, okay? So then, of course, if you order a starter kit, you're going to get all these, like a bunch of different assorted colors. And in each bag, you get however many it tells you in the listing of the pieces. So in this one, I have all the pieces I need. We have end caps as well as the female and male ends. So they're all color coded, and you can keep them by color sorted into the little baggies. Okay, so let's go in and install one first, just so you can see how this would work. I just have a piece of foam with some fabric that's been basted onto it, okay? Let me grab, let's do red so that it can stand out for y'all on camera. So I need 4 parts. Remember I mentioned we need 4 parts to installing a snap? So I need 2 end caps for sure, because 1 end cap goes with the female end and 1 end cap goes to hold the male end of the snap. So those are my 4 pieces. 1 sticks out. 1 is the socket that this is going to go into here, and then the end caps are identical. They're the same. It doesn't matter, which end cap you put with which stud or socket piece, okay? It just needs 1 with it. Now, one quick tip that a lot of beginners mess up at first is like you want to make sure, okay, let me make sure that the size of this snap fits correctly. They'll go like this and grab the male end and install it. Don't do that, because you won't have any fabric behind it and the end cap holding it, you're not going to have anything to grab to separate them, okay? So if you start using like a flathead screwdriver, you're going to bend it up, and that snap is no longer going to be in a decent working condition for you to actually install in a project, okay? So just keep them like that. If they're all together in the same baggie, they will fit, they work together. So I'm going to slide these guys off. Say we want to install one here and here. And this is going to depend on your project, right? But we're usually assuming it's a pocket, some type of a flap or something where you need that closure. So I'm going to install them here and here so that we can snap these guys together, okay? So if I poke a hole wherever I want it, right? If it's a flap like this, you would measure the center, measure a little bit up. You don't want to be measuring super close to the bottom edge because you'll still need fabric sticking out here. You don't want that snap to be installed right on the edge. It will make easy work of ripping that fabric, and you don't want that. So always place it a little bit up. I typically will go, depending on what fabric I'm using, about 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch up from wherever the bottom seam edge or the raw edge of the fabric is. Okay. So I've poked the stiletto or the awl right all the way through. If you have multiple layers, you got to go all the way through. Otherwise, you won't be able to install the snap. Now, if I want this to close here, and you always got to do this visually, I tell my students, stop and think first. If these two need to snap together, that means I need a male and a female end on this pretty side of the fabric. right? That means that the end caps that are holding the male and female ends of the snaps need to be on this foam side that has no fabric. So let's do that. We're going to take our end cap and slide it up in there. Now, the more layers you have, the more you're going to have to squish the fabric down, because if you look at the prong that we have, and I'll give you a little close-up for those of you that maybe have never worked with this before. You see that little prong? I mean, it's not even 1/4 of an inch tall. Okay, so if your fabric layers are thicker than that, you may want to seek out some snaps that are going to be a little bit longer, that have a longer center prong there, so that you can get it through. But usually if we're working on something like this, 2, 3, 4 layers even with this bulky foam, it's squishable. So I can compress it down, all right, so that I can expose that prong and I can see it really well there. Then I'm going to take either or, the male or the female end, and place it right here. And again, I kind of squish it down. Now we take the handheld snap setting tool, the pliers here, and this is where a lot of beginners mess up. If you look at the piece that's in here, and I'm trying to see, yep, you can kind of see it. Inside this little rubber thing, you'll see that there's a hole, and it has a little piece of a metal right in there. Well, that little metal piece needs to be what comes down onto, when I press it like this, when I compress the handle, needs to squish down that metal prong that's coming up in between this male end of my snap. So what happens is the prong that's sticking up gets smashed down, and when it gets squished down, it then is sandwiched between the male end and the end cap, and that is what holds the snap in place, okay? So it's important to understand what is going on and what you need to do in order to know that, yes, you're doing it correctly, the snap is properly installed. So if you put it right down in the middle, and this is the part that I'm saying a lot of beginners mess up, it's like you cannot just put it over it and crank it, okay? You have to make sure that that little center metal piece is aligned in with the center of your snap. If not, this is what's going to happen. And I'm offsetting it. Can you see how that's offset? If you can see some of the snap, it's off. And if I offset it and squish down, look what happened. I smashed down the ridge of the male end of the snap. So obviously I didn't squish down the prong, so it's not held together. You can still see the prong sticking up there, okay? So this is one mistake that beginners can often make. In this case, because the center prong is not squished down, you don't have to like properly remove it because it's never been attached, right? You busted the outer ridge. Now, so this is no good. You can get rid of that male end. So now you're gonna need to grab another male end. So for this one, I'm gonna do two things. I'm going to install it correctly, which is by squishing down that center prong. And then I'm going to go back in and squish it again and wreck the side like I did there. That way you'll see how we can remove it. So I center it to properly install it. You got to like squish a little bit and feel for where it's perfectly centered. Look around that you don't have any excess of that snap sticking out. Then you know, okay, it's probably centered, feels good. I squish down. That center prong has been squished. You can see this is not coming up, okay? So this is technically properly installed. But if you happen to kind of squish down the prong a little bit, but also break down and crush the edge, like I'm about to do here, sometimes that happens where you do that all at the same time. See, the center prong is smashed down, so it's attached, but I've also wrecked the side of the socket here. In this case, this is one where you would want to remove it so that you could properly install a fresh one, okay? Now, I have removed tons of these over the years. And I think I read somewhere when I first started using these snaps that they were designed to be used like to snap in and snap off like 10,000 times, okay? You're never going to reach that 10,000 times. By then, the fabric of the project will have worn out and you'll make another one anyways, okay? But this is how I take them off. I usually grab a lighter, okay? And carefully put it close. Make sure you don't burn your fabric, right? Because this is cotton fabric. It's not just going to melt like a synthetic fabric would. It's going to turn black because you're burning it. So I usually will just notice I have the flame sticking up. I'm not going like this because that flame is a lot bigger than the area that I have the snap covering. So I want to go flame up and get close, but with the bottom side of the flame. And I'm just letting that flame melt that plastic. The more of the plastic that I can melt in the center, the softer it's going to be, the easier it will be for me to remove. And I can see the plastic bubbling. I'm going to stop. Be super careful that you don't touch this. Melted plastic like that is going to beyond burn you, okay? Now, I don't grab the stiletto. Remember, this guy is sharp, so if you slip and you poke yourself, you're not going to be happy. Instead, grab like a flathead screwdriver like this one. And look, it's bubbling and still melted to the point where it just slid right off. Okay, I haven't burned my fabric, but the other thing is that you also, because I was trying to flip it, or excuse me, because I was trying to melt it down the center, I melted a little bit of that already squished down prong, and that means that I can also remove the prong off the back end, and you'll just have to start all over, okay, with a whole new set of the end cap and the male or female end, whichever one you were replacing, okay? Careful that you don't touch that right away, just leave it. Once it cools off, you know, it gets hard again, it's plastic, and then you can toss it, okay? So that is how I would do that. Whoop, almost knocked this off. Let me go ahead and install it. For those of you that are thinking maybe you'd be interested in working on projects that feature these snaps, I'll show you real quick, without making any mistakes, hopefully, how I install them. So again, the 4 parts, 1 male, 1 female end, 2 end caps. I still have that hole. My fabric is not burnt, so even if you remove one, you can go back in and just reinstall a fresh set of snap parts in that area, okay? So that's how I do it. If you don't have a lighter, one thing that I've used in the past too is like wire cutters. I don't chop the fabric, but I'll go in and kind of just with the tip of it, snip at that outer ridge. If it's the male end, I'll snip and kind of crack it back, snip and crack it back. And as you open up that area, it also tends to come apart easily. But if you have a lighter on hand, I find that that's the quickest way, as long as you make sure that that flame doesn't hit your fabric, because then you're going to make the project worse. And this is a tricky part too, is removing these snaps, because oftentimes the installation of the snap is the last step. So you've spent all this time and money and energy and pretty fabrics, made this cute pouch, and then if you install the snap incorrectly, you don't want to wreck the project or have to start over. So use that tip, okay? Now, if I want this to snap here, what I often do, and this is how I teach it in my classes, is that I have my students install the male end first, because it has a ridge, it's sticking out, right? So when I fold it, instead of measuring on the other side and maybe messing up your math, I will use the snap itself where it's already installed to fold it over and say, hey, where does the other end need to be so that these two snap together evenly and not like lopsided like that, in case your math is off. Well, if you do the male end first and you go like this and fold it over, if you press down really, really good, you can get a little ridge right there that's created from the male end. And then, you know, if I make my hole right in the center, I'm going to center the other end of that snap, okay? So I push the end cap in, squish the fabric down around the side so that the prong is sticking up. This is the female end. And you use the same pliers to install both, the male and the female end. So it's super simple. See how quick that is? And now you can go in and snap them two together, and that would be your project, okay? Wherever, you know, the pattern calls for you to install the snap. So you just snap in, snap out, okay? So that is how we do that, and troubleshoot it so that you can, you know, remove any that were improperly installed in the first place. Let me put all my supplies back in because I don't like to not have them in place when I need them. Okay, so that is that one. Mary Else has been wondering about these snaps, if they are worth it. They're super fun to have, and it's pretty affordable, like 20 or 30 bucks, and you get a whole assortment. That way you'll have all the different colors you need, no matter, you know, when the project calls for, and that way you can match it up with your projects, either so that it blends in or that you get a little pop of color like I have here on these little Kendall snap pouches, okay? This is a super easy project, and they make quick gifts if you need to make something quick to sell at a craft fair. There's no zippers involved, there's no buttons, there's no fancy closures. It's just boom, boom, literally seconds to install those snaps. All right? So definitely, if you want to find any projects that I have featuring snaps on my YouTube channel, just do a quick search at youtube.com, type in the words CraftyGemini, snap pouch. Excuse me, let me have a sip of water. And whatever videos I have with the snaps, they'll pop up for you. Again, a quick plug, my Duo project bag. This is an online paid-for course. I put it on sale just for the next 48 hours. So you get $10 off if you want to sign up for this class. Again, clear vinyl, snap closure on the front here. So you can store whatever projects. It's great for taking to like retreats or little classes, you know, sew days with your guild at the library or with friends. And we have a zippered pocket in the back for the second, that dual compartment. Okay? So let's get this out of the way, and now we're going to move on to the next. Well, let me see if there were any questions about this one. Diane says, I have such anxiety when installing snaps. Come on, Miss Diane, you can do this. Easy peasy. Well, another great way also is to practice installing it just on scrap pieces like I did. So if you're going to be making a pouch that features foam, grab a little a scrap piece, put some fabric, and do what I did here, just so that you get the hang of it, you know, especially with the centering of the pliers. Then if you're working on something else that features 3 or 4 layers, make yourself a little sample piece that kind of mimics what you'll be doing in the actual finished project and install it on that. Once you install 2 or 3 of these, you'll get it down, and then trust me, it's super easy and it's a great way. Sometimes you'll get to a project, it calls for a different closure, and then you're like, you know what, I don't have time for this. I'm just gonna put a snap on it, and it works super quick to do. Okay, let me just go check. Dana says, if punching through both sides at the same time, will it line up correctly? Yes, as long as you have everything aligned when you are making that hole with the awl. So something that I do is, like, if I mark it with a pen where I want to install the snap first, I will hold, you see these 2 fingers, and I kind of hold it taut like this in my hand, so that both, if I have fabric on the back or on the front, I'm still holding it steady with my 2 fingers sandwiched up here, and then these 2 fingers are sandwiching down here so that nothing moves in that area, and I'm keeping my fingers away from that awl, because remember, that sharp point, trust me, you do not want to get it anywhere near you. This thing will go right through, okay? So I hold it top and bottom, and then I'll poke straight. Don't lean the awl either, because then you're going to be going in at an angle, and that is going to make it so that it's not matched up on the other side, right? So it needs to be straight. One tip for that is to kind of align it like this onto your cutting mat and just poke it through straight down. Once it starts to go through, then you can kind of flip it over and finish adding a little bit more force to it so it can go through straight. Okay, so hopefully those tips help y'all as well. Okay. Oh, awesome. Karen says, I just bought that duo project bag. Great. I can't wait to see what fabrics you choose. And in case you're wondering about that project, y'all, we do sell the clear vinyl as well. So if you're thinking, oh, I have everything else, but I don't have the clear vinyl, we have that in our shop as well. And I believe the video course features a 2-page PDF of text instructions that will help supplement the video lessons. And then there's 8 video lessons, if I'm not mistaken, okay? And quickly for dimensions, because I always get those questions, it measures about 12.5 inches by 12.5 inches this way, and I would say about 1.5 inches high here. We do make a couple of pleats on the front so that you could potentially fill it with, you know, more bulkier stuff, and then we still have room to close up the snap, so you could fit a little bit more here. I would say probably even to like 2.5 or 3 inches thick. You know, you don't want to be stuffing it to the gills either, but you know, you have a good front pocket there that you can fit bulkier stuff like yarn or even more fabric than these 6 fat quarters. All right, great. Let's see. All right, so let's move on to the second question. So the second and the fourth question that I'm answering today kind of have a lot to do with each other. So I'm going to answer one first, and then we're going to take that from that point and go into the next one. So the question is from Heather. And Heather asks, why are patterns written with so many different seam allowances? I can understand your frustration, Heather. She says, is it mostly custom? It seems that quilting is consistent at 1/4 inch, or in your case, a scant 1/4 inch, LOL, but bag making and even garments seem all over the place. I get that sometimes one needs to go very narrow or trim to 1/8 inch later, right, like after sewing the seam, but why sometimes 1/4 inch, sometimes 3/8 inch, and sometimes even wider, 1/2 inch or more? When you are designing patterns, how do you decide? So I know a lot of you out there are probably like, yes, Heather, I'm glad you asked that question, because you feel the same way. And the seam allowance is going to depend on, first of all, what industry it is, right? We know that if you're using the big patterns like the simplicity patterns, McCall's and stuff like that, most of those, if the garment calls for woven fabrics, typically you'll see a seam allowance of 5/8 inch. And for a quilter, when you go from a scant 1/4 inch to 5/8, you're like, my goodness, why are they wasting so much fabric, right? These seam allowances are huge, but it may be because in a specific step, they'll call for a different seam finishing technique. It also ensures, especially for beginners, if you don't have anyone next to you helping you make that project, it ensures that you're grabbing both fabrics. Like, it's enough of a significant seam allowance to ensure that you're grabbing both layers of the fabric. If you're working with finer fabrics, which we typically tend to do in some garments, right? In quilting, most of the quilting cottons, if they're decent quality, they're about the same weight. So we won't have that issue. You're not going to have a significantly thinner more prone to fraying fabric over another quilting cotton. That's not as oftenly found as in garment sewing. So if you have a really fine fabric, if you use a scant seam allowance, chances are it can fray on you, okay? Especially if the pattern doesn't call for a specific finishing technique that will prevent that. So it's going to depend on the industry, whether it's garment sewing, bag making, and things like that, and also on the designer. So for example, on these little pouches, depending on the seam allowance that you use, like if I told y'all sew an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, right? Some of you could probably sew an 1/8 of an inch. Some of you are going to be like, how am I going to sew an 1/8 of an inch? The narrowest seam allowance I've ever sewn is 1/4 of an inch, and I don't even have a foot to go that narrow, right? So for something like that, the pattern may tell you sew 1/4 of an inch, then go back in and trim it down so you have less seam allowance sticking out. So in that case, if you're like me and you're always thinking like, why are they wasting so much? You might be wondering, why would they waste? But oftentimes they just give you a little bit extra room there in the seam allowance because it's easier to hold the fabrics. It's easier to guide the fabrics through the sewing machine. And then it's a quick step to just go back in and trim them down. But it's going to depend on what the project actually is. Okay? Windless Original says, I definitely thought that when I went from quilting to garment making. Absolutely. A lot of us quilters. Because you think 1/4 of an inch is just right? It holds everything together, and then you get this pattern. It's telling you 5/8, 5/8, 5/8, and you have 5/8 being deducted all around. You're like, that's a lot of fabric. But it just depends, right? Sometimes they'll have you use a specific finishing technique. Sometimes they'll have you press garment seams open and then turn under the edges. And you wouldn't be able to do that if you were working with a narrow 1/4 of an inch seam. There wouldn't be enough in each of the open seam allowance sides to tuck it under and then top stitch it, right? So it depends on the project, depends on the designer. And it's just going to depend. Okay, so read the instructions, and I think it's important, part of this, especially 1/4 of an inch, 3/8, and 5/8 of an inch at the minimum, this is going to give you good practice on figuring out and familiarizing yourself with your specific sewing machine, okay? Do you need a specialty foot if you want to get that really scant 1/4 of an inch seam allowance? If you do 3/8 of an inch, is it in the center needle position like mine? So like this machine, I already know, I use it, I've been using it almost every day, and definitely on these weekly shows for a couple years now. I know that on this Juki LB5020, we're currently sold out. I know there's like 10 of you on the wait list. As soon as we get new machines in, we'll put them in stock. But the center needle position, the default position, is in the middle. And I know that from there to the edge of my regular universal foot on here is 3/8 of an inch. I know that. If you're working on a new machine, give yourself a little post-it note, stick it right there. Do the same thing if you have multiple sewing machines that require different settings to get you the correct seam allowance that you need, okay? 3/8 of an inch for me is in the middle, default center position. Of course, scant 1/4 of an inch is here. When I move that needle position to 5.0, the default is 3.5, so that's center needle position. If I want a scant 1/4 of an inch, I don't change my foot. I leave the same foot on. I just scoot the needle over to the right there. That gives me a scant 1/4 inch. And if I'm going to sew a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, I leave the needle in the center position, and then I just use the 5/8 inch line on the side. So it's important to even dabble in the different projects that call for different seam allowances so that you can feel comfortable. The key is that if you are comfortable sewing straight, it's not going to matter what the seam allowance is. Really, at the end of the day, that's what it boils down to. I could tell you 1/8 of an inch, and I can tell you 1 1/4 inch. You should be able to still sew it straight, okay? So, so that was that question from Heather. Now going into taking the same information that we're talking about here into the second question that's by Julie, and Julie asks, well, she says is first, when I was a kid, we always used a 1/2 of an inch seam allowance on everything, okay? She says now everything is a 1/4 of an inch. When I use that in a quilt, after washing, it frays out. Why did they switch? So I wanted to mention this. Again, things used to be 1/2 of an inch. I think garment patterns used to be 1/2 of an inch. In the industry, like garment sewing industry, that is the standard as far as I know, is 1/2 of an inch. But when they get into stretch knit fabrics, the industry standard is a 1/4 of an inch. But again, for garment sewers who are going maybe from those big brand patterns that are 5/8 of an inch for woven fabric, if you switch somebody to a stretch knit and it jumps from 5/8 to 1/4, that's going to be really narrow for people to be like, I can barely hold the fabric together and still stitch straight, right? Unless you're a quilter, because every seam we sew is pretty much a 1/4 of an inch. So we have experience with that, but maybe the home sewer doesn't, okay? So again, it's going to depend on the pattern and what they're telling you to do. Just follow it, you know? Once you start designing your own stuff, you can decide, are you going to include seam allowances? Are you going to have people add it on? Some of the European brands of sewing patterns, you'll see that the lines as you're tracing out the patterns will be for the finished measurements. And then they tell you add 3/8 of an inch, 1 centimeter, 1.5 centimeters to the seam allowance. And that way, in that instance, you can add whatever seam allowance you want to, right? As long as you're consistent with it and you include that as you're cutting out your pieces, you're still going to end up with the correctly finished size of that garment, okay? So for Julie's saying when she uses 1/4 of an inch for a quilt, after washing, she says it frays. So this is what I wanted to touch on. There's something going on because 1/4 of an inch, Julie, should not be fraying for you, okay? So it could be a few different things. One, it could be that you're sewing too scant of 1/4 of an inch. Now, if we look at this quilt block, we can see here that this was sewn with 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And I sew scant 1/4 inch seam allowances because when it's finished and sewn, accounting for the width of my thread, I want it to be a true 1/4 of an inch, okay? So this right here, and this block is months old. Granted, it has not been washed, but these angles are cut at a bias, so that's why you don't really see it fraying. Whereas if you see something along the crosswise or lengthwise grain, this is more likely to fray. You see like those little threads coming off. But that's not enough to make a seam come out, okay, and be fraying. So what I'm thinking is either your seam allowance is too short or too narrow, your stitch length may be too long. If your stitch length is too long, there's more give in there in between each individual stitch to where if the seam allowance is super narrow and you have long stitches, any type of pressure that you place on that seam in reference to like yanking on one fabric or the other or any type of friction, it's going to make it more likely to fray or to slip out in one area, okay? Another thing that could be causing it is if your seam allowance is inconsistent. And I know that a lot of us have been here before. Say you start off sewing really nicely, your 1/4 of an inch, and then, something happened, you weren't paying attention, or maybe your pieces weren't cut very accurately, and you just went, woo, really, really narrow to like 1/8 or 1/16 of an inch, okay? But you see that it still grabbed the fabric. Then you just like readjust a little bit and keep going and finish it off. Well, you know what's gonna happen is that in that area where you went super narrow, that's where it's more likely to pull. Okay, the fabric is going to be more, you're going to have more fabric exposed on the pretty side of the block. So it's going to kind of bubble over in that area. And so it makes it more likely that it's going to get more pulled apart in that area. And then after a couple washings, you'll probably start to see a few threads come out. And then you're like, oh no, I have a hole in there. Okay, so even if the whole seam wasn't done like that, if you have a small area that was really narrow with the seam allowance, that can happen to you too. So be careful. If that does happen, I recommend just going a little bit further back, starting with stitches again, and then making sure that the full seam allowance that is called for is what you're actually stitching. If you see that it grabbed the fabric, do not assume it's going to stay in that perfect precision point, right, after washings. If it's too close, it will pull out and fray, okay? So that's a couple things that I'm talking about there. So your seam allowance can be either inconsistent, in some areas really, really narrow. The whole seam allowance could be really, really narrow and causing that to come out and fray. Another one is if the quality of your fabric is, on the cheaper, lesser side, the weave of that fabric is going to be more loose, more open, giving it an opportunity for stitches that are maybe even a little bit longer not to grab that many threads of your fabric, and that can make it fray. But if you use a regular 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, I mean, it should not be fraying at all. You can see in this sample quilt block here, this is years old, okay? And even the edges are not fraying. If we look at the back too, I mean, the seams, a 1/4 of an inch is solid. Plus, if you're making a quilt, if we think about the construction of an actual finished quilt, we have 3 layers to what we call the quilt sandwich. We have the quilt top, which is this, usually, whatever pretty design that you've stitched up yourself. Then you have that middle layer, which is your batting, and this can be cotton, bamboo, wool, a blended one, polyester, whatever it is. But this is what adds that thickness, the fluffiness, and the warmth to your quilt. This goes in the middle. And then you have fabric on the back as well. So that's the third layer of the quilt sandwich, and this is your backing fabric, okay? After you have sewn all those 1/4 of an inch seams to make the quilt top, when you layer these 3 layers together, remember, we still go back in and do some quilting. So if you do quilting on your project, which means stitching through all 3 layers of the quilt sandwich, you're also going to be reinforcing those seam allowances stuck in there in the quilt sandwich. So even if something is fraying slightly in the wash, you should not have holes in your seams, okay? If you used a nice short stitch length, good quality fabric, good quality thread, it should be working just fine for you. Okay, so I would check to see if, you know, none of those things are playing into your 1/4 inch seams that you say are fraying there, Julie. But hopefully that helps. Okay, let me check real quick in the questions to make sure I'm not missing anything. All right. Oh, great. Karen says she got the duo bag. Tamara says it's perfect for 12-inch quilt blocks. Thank you. Yes, it is, because it finishes 12.5 inches. So you can put those 12.5-inch blocks right in there and take them with you. Nancy's asking, where do I find the form to ask a question for WIP Wednesday? So if you're on our email newsletter list, Nancy, I always include it in the WIP Wednesday emails. There's a hyperlink that you can click for the Google document where you can submit your question. It's also right here if you're watching on Facebook in the caption. And then if you're catching it on YouTube, which I see that you are, it's in the description box of the video. It'll tell you if you want to submit, here's the link. Okay? Great. All right, so let's move on to the 4th question. And the 4th question comes from Carol. Carol asks, am I doing something wrong if the top fabric and the bottom fabric don't come out even at the end of my stitching 2 pieces together? Is this tension? So this is a great question, and a lot of us that have been sewing for a long time probably don't even think about this anymore. But I know that it happens, especially if you're working with more pliable fabrics or things like a faux leather or something that's a little bit stretchy or squishy. It tends to happen more to us even if we have a lot of sewing experience. Okay, so here's what she's talking about. Let me cut this. Whoops, sent that flying. So say you have 2 pieces of fabric. I'm just going to cut this here. And we need to sew these 2 together. Okay, say along here. Carol's asking, when she's sewing this seam with these 2 fabrics together, sometimes she ends up with one being a little longer at the end than the other, right? And so this happens a lot to us too as quilters. If we are sewing individual patchwork units together, like you have multiple rows and you need to put them together, when you get to the end, even if you've been matching up all your intersecting points, you get to the end and you're like, this one's a little bit longer than the other, okay? So some of the things that are going to help with this are, 1, to minimize the length of the seams that you're sewing. And you may not always be able to do that because if you didn't design it, or if the pattern calls for long sewing seams, you're not going to be able to do too much in terms of that, shortening it. The next thing is going to be how you hold your fabrics together. So I recommend some fine pins that you can really align your fabric pieces together as best as you can. And the pins, if you go in and then up, you don't have to go in, up a bunch of times. Just insert it once. If it's a good quality pin and it's pretty fine, it will hold those layers right in place. So whether you're using it to match up intersections in quilt blocks or just right there the edge of a couple of pieces of fabric, if it's a project where you really have to be super precise and you don't want to run into that issue where one piece is longer than the other, feel free to put more pins, okay? Sometimes when we take these shortcuts, then we look and we're like, I wish I would have gone in and put some pins. So even if you just put one in the center, the top, and the bottom, that will help keep especially the top and bottom edges from being moved, right? You align it here, start sewing there accurately, you know you're going to be good, and then the only other point that you really will want to match up is at the end, that last corner, you don't want them to move. So you can put a pin just above the end. And the trick to doing that, if you pin it and it's in the correct spot, the trick for keeping it right there is to not remove that pin right up until you almost get to that pin. If you're here and you're sewing and then you remove these pin, you're giving yourself these 2 inches here of fabric where it can distort and move on you, okay? So this is one option, is the pins. I do not like to use the plastic sewing clips when I'm just sewing 2 layers of cotton fabric. The fabric is too flimsy and the weight of the clip is way too heavy. So you'll see, like if I put the clip there, you see how it falls back because of the weight of that clip. And so I find that it's not as accurate as pins. But an even better one is going to be to use some glue. So you can use a washable Elmer's glue with one of those fine tips put on this one. This is a new bottle, so it doesn't have the tip on it quite yet. You could also use something like a wash away wonder tape. This is a double-sided sticky tape that you can put in the seam. It washes away. You can stick it down, you kind of scratch it on, and then peel the paper backing side, and it's just a sticky strip that's 1/4 of an inch wide. So you can do that in the seam allowance to hold it. You can do the glue, and if you use a wet glue like Elmer's washable glue, I would definitely go in and set it with the heat of a dry iron, because you do not want to sew through wet glue. You want it to be dried, okay? So I would just put like 3 dots Press it on the ironing board just like this through the fabric layers so that it dries that and it will hold it exactly where you need it to be. Okay, another troubleshooting tip for that, if you have your fabric layers moving on you, is to check the pressure of the presser foot. Now, not all machines will have that dial up here, and you can see mine doesn't have it. But some of the older machines, vintage machines, some mechanical machines, I have seen it on computerized machines as well. You'll have to check your user manual to see if you have that option, okay? It'll have a knob up here that you can tighten or loosen to adjust the amount of bite that the presser foot is applying to your project. So if it's chomping down too hard, in other words, when I go like this to sew, if I put that presser foot down and I am just struggling to sew, you see how I don't even have to hold it and this machine is pulling it through? I know that this does not have a ton of pressure coming down onto the fabric. Some of you may, have hand-me-down machines that maybe haven't been serviced in years. If you cannot do this and it doesn't pull the fabric through, then if you find that you're like having to like push the fabric through the front or worse, yank on it through the back, like really pull on it to get it to go through, you may need to look for that adjustment setting there to release the amount of chomp that it has. We're gators. I say chomp for everything. It's like chomp. But you know what I mean, the bite down of the presser foot onto the fabric. And that actually comes in handy. So if you do have a machine like that, it's really helpful to like increase that chompy bite on a thinner fabric so that they don't slip and slide around on you. But then also you can loosen it if you have multiple layers or thicker layers, you're working on projects that have, exterior fabric, foam, different stabilizers, and you find that the fabric, like you're stitching and it's not moving, then that means, hey, the bite is too hard and it's not allowing the machine to pull the fabric layers through like this, okay? This is ideal. All right, so that means I don't have to do anything really. For the amount of fabric layers that are going through, the machine is pulling it through just fine, okay? Let's check here. Lucy's asking, Ola from Dallas, Texas. She says, do you sell those pins? I think we do. They might be in stock. You want to check for them on our shop, CraftyGemini.com. In the products page, just do a quick search for magic pins and see if we have any in stock. Whenever y'all are shopping in our online shop, if you see something that says sold out, there is a box right underneath a sold out product that tells you to enter your email address. And then whenever we restock it or it's back in inventory, you'll instantly get an email from our e-commerce system telling you, hey, this product is back in stock. So in case it's sold out for you, you can do that. All right, let's see. Yes, Windless Original says, I often use glue and I really like it. I use washable school glue. Yep, that we do a lot. That's called, in quilting, it's called glue basting. For those of you that are maybe new to the technique, it's not new at all. It's been out for decades and decades and decades. But it's a quick, cool way to kind of hold your fabrics together without running the risk of poking yourself with pins or having that extra weight of the plastic clips like I mentioned earlier, okay? Becky says, if the difference falls within my seam allowance, I stick a Post-it on it and put it in my special handling stack. Don't end up with too many bad ones. That's a great tip. Yep. So it's important too, the more you sew, the more different types of projects you tackle, the more you will understand how different things act differently, okay? Now, I will say, sometimes if you are a little bit more advanced or you are working on, say, curved projects or projects where you're sewing maybe like a cork fabric to then a cotton fabric. If you're mixing and matching fabrics, you know that they're both not going to behave the same. So, for example, in the instance of this project, my Duo project bag, which I mentioned is on sale for the next 48 hours, we're sewing vinyl to the front here, but the vinyl gets quilted to the front of cotton fabric. Then it has foam stabilizer and another cotton backing fabric here. So when you're sewing down the side seams, if you sign up for this class, you'll see in the video lessons, I'm giving you tips on how to keep the vinyl from stretching, okay? Because it's being sewn to 3 layers behind it. You have fabric, foam interfacing, and backing fabric. So fabric, foam, and fabric again. And then we're sewing the clear vinyl to it. You know that if you're working with, if you've tried it before, a thinner vinyl, thin vinyl can almost always like be stretched, like it's more pliable. So if you're sewing with this on top, pretend if you were stitching something like this, it's going to get hung up unless you install the Teflon foot on your sewing machine so that the sticky part of the vinyl doesn't stick to your foot, unless you put tape underneath this. And so there's lots of tips that I share with you also on how you can sew different types of fabrics together so that you don't end up with the same issue that we're talking about, where if you're using a thinner vinyl, we sell a good weight vinyl in our shop that would be perfect for this project. But if you're using a thinner one, you might end up with the vinyl sticking out even as much as an inch beyond the edge of your project. And then you're going to have to trim it and hope you have enough and try to square it up on the other side. So those are like little nightmare things that sometimes we have to deal with. But if you understand what's going on and it's because one fabric stretches while the other one does not, then you can help, troubleshoot those things and set yourself up better for, better results. Okay, so whether it's adjusting that top pressure adjustment or pinning or clipping correctly at the bottom, at the end, in the center, so you make sure that it doesn't move on you. Another tip, when you're sewing two different types of fabrics where one can end up a little bit longer than the other, is we say in quilting saggy bottom. So you think the saggier of the fabrics that you're sewing towards the bottom. And what does that do? That means that if you have a fabric that has more give and more play, it's saggier or can be more easily stretched and distorted, we want it down against our feed dogs, because the feed dogs, for those that don't know, are these little metal teeth, these little ridges that come up and down from the bottom of the sewing machine. Let me get rid of the foot so you can see it better. They come up and down as the machine stitches. It's what allows the fabric to go through, like I showed you earlier, where I'm not even touching the fabric and it's feeding through. It's the feed dogs that are feeding the fabric through. They go up and down, and they pull the fabric through as the machine takes every single stitch. So when you have a fabric that is maybe cut on the bias or is a little bit baggier, or it's a project that has some type of pleats or something and you have to kind of like hold it like that or place pins where there's folds and things, the baggier or the saggier of the layers needs to go down towards the bottom, because these feed dogs will actually help feed in that excess bulk of fabric. Versus putting the saggier one on top, I can almost guarantee you 9 times out of 10 you will end up with that saggier one on top. It will be longer when you get to the end of the seam. Okay, so remember that in the future. Saggy bottom. So the saggier, stretchier, more easily distorted fabric of the two, put it down towards the feed dogs. If not, the other option is using a walking foot. If your machine has one, or if you have bought one in your accessory bin for your machine, a walking foot comes in really, really handy, because it's a specialty foot that puts the same type of feed dogs that we have on the underside of the machine here. It puts it on the underside of the presser foot. So now you'll have 2 sets of feed dogs working together as the machine stitches to pull the fabric through evenly. And I'm trying to grab here. See, with this machine, I don't really have an issue sewing through the multiple layers. Nope, I don't have it up here. I rarely put the walking foot on this thing. Let me see. Nope, not in here either. But I have shared the walking foot before. And you can always check your user manual and see if it came with yours. It's called a walking foot. It looks way different than all these feet. It's usually like a larger, clunkier foot because it has more going on, okay? And that way, like I said, it'll have feed dogs on the foot. So you can have a fabric underneath and then have the walking foot on top, and the feed dogs on the walking foot will help feed everything more evenly, okay? So hopefully that helps. Brenda says, Bob, bias on the bottom. That's right. So bias fabric, we know, right? If we cut on a bias grain of woven fabrics like this can be stretched. So this is what I mean by saggier, more easily distorted. Any fabric that just can be easily distorted as you're sewing your seam, that's what you would want to have down towards the feed dogs so that it can help you feed them through easily. Okay? Oh, awesome. Mary says, I've been nervous about sewing with vinyl, but I think I'm ready. I like your vinyl bag. You can totally do it. It's easy. It is not hard at all. It's just, getting our hands, our eyes, and our brain accustomed to working with something different. A lot of times, whenever you introduce something different or new, people freak out a little bit. But if you know how to sew straight, you know how to put that presser foot up or down and thread your machine, you can sew through any of these types of fabrics for sure. All right, great question. ATL Lady Leo is asking, should you increase or decrease the pressure for vinyls? So if you're talking about pressure in terms of what I mentioned earlier, if your machine has that pressure setting here, I would lessen the pressure. because the bigger the chomp, the more that stickiness of the vinyl is going to want to stick to your presser foot, okay? So I actually have a video on my YouTube channel. If y'all go to youtube.com, just type in CraftyGemini vinyl tips, and I have a video where I share with you a bunch of tips specifically for sewing with that clear vinyl. So if you think you're ready to order a roll, we sell the clear vinyl in our shop at craftygemini.com/shop, and then you can watch that video. You'll be set. You can start making a ton of different little clear vinyl projects, okay? Excuse me, let me drink some water. Let me just double check I'm not missing anything, but I think that's it. We've answered those 4 questions. I shared a bunch of tips, so hopefully that helps some of you out there. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends on the different social media sites. And of course, if you're watching me on YouTube and you're not yet subscribed to my channel, make sure you go ahead and do that too, so you don't miss out on any of the future videos. Deborah's asking, can you leave the walking foot on for general sewing? You can. There's, I think I saw a question like that also that was submitted. It was like, when do you not want to use a walking foot? And really, I couldn't really think of a time where I specifically didn't want to. Maybe if it's something really fine, where I didn't have that pressure setting that I could loosen it up, and maybe when I sewed with the walking foot, I saw that like it was leaving marks on the fabric. So maybe if you're working with a really soft vinyl and you're using a ton of layers, multiple layers of interfacings and foam, sometimes that chomp can be a little bit too much. And as it's using the walking foot, sometimes it leaves marks that like are dragging across the fabric. That might be an instance, but from stretch knits to wovens to bulky layers, I mean, a walking foot is great to have. Some of you that maybe have those FOF machines that have that built-in dual feed system, great. I have another Juki back here. This is the Keyray. I think it's the NX7, and that one has that option too, where I can like pull down a built-in walking foot little thing to help feed through the top without having to change out the full foot. So that's really helpful too. Okay, yes, I'm so glad that you all are enjoying these tips. Thank you for tuning in. If you're watching the recording, make sure that you sign up for our email newsletter at craftygemini.com. If you're not on our email newsletter, that is where I let you all know the WIP Wednesday episodes, any sales, things that we're doing, when you can expect the next new courses, retreats, and all that kind of stuff. Okay? All right, well, that was super fun. Y'all are asking some really great questions. Remember that you can submit questions for me to consider in a future WIP Wednesday episode by using the link that we've included in the caption on Facebook and in the video description box right here on YouTube. So thanks again for watching, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your week, and I'll see y'all in the next video.